Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Education meeting. There are some things over to the side if you would like to be reading those as we go along on the table. First item is to review and approve the agenda. Any suggested changes? Is there a motion? Allison, and seconded by Sherry. Thank you very much. All those in favor of accepting the agenda, please indicate. That is unanimous for all that are here. Now approve the minutes from January 5th, 2015. Did anyone have any changes or recommendations to those? I don't see any hands. A motion to accept those. Thank you, Jean. And a second. Thank you, Jen. All those in favor, please signify by raising your hands. Thank you. That's unanimous. Comments from the public. To ensure the public's right to be heard, the board has set aside time during the meeting for public comments. 2 minutes are allotted to each speaker and a maximum of 15 minutes to each subject. Is there anyone who would like to speak? There being no one who is indicating they want to speak, we will then move on to reports and recognition. And we're going to be first having the SACS Building Committee update. And I believe Mrs. Rashin's going to start us with that.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here tonight in a kind of a different role than usual as chair of the SACS Auditorium Building Committee. As you all know, in this year's capital budget, we had $175,000 to start the planning process to renovate the 58-year-old SACS Auditorium. So the SACS Auditorium Building Committee was formed in the summer, and we've been meeting 2 or 3 times a month, pretty long meetings since then. The members are, I'm chair. We have Jim Bell, who's here as vice chair, and Ken Campbell, as secretary. Bill Walbert is on it, Molly Ludke, Nancy Harris, Alan Sneath, and we also have advisory members, Superintendent Lutzy, Principal Greg Vecito, Bob Willoughby, Hazel Hobbs, and Sangeeta Appel. So we've got a very interested group. So to get started, our committee talked to the SACS and the VPA administration and teachers, and we went toward the auditorium, and we toured a bunch of other school auditoriums. We hired SLAM as owner's representative and to do a feasibility study, and we hired Ty and Bond to do environmental testing. Now tonight, we're not here to talk about the results of the environmental testing. The administration is preparing a report on that, and that will be reported to the Board of Ed and to the parents and to staff at meetings where Ty and Bond is present later this month. So tonight we're here to talk about the project. So the building committee, first what we did is we verified, is the auditorium is important, and we found that yes, indeed, it's a key asset for the school and for the community. But it has serious deficiencies. Its HVAC is shot, the sound, the lighting, the rigging, the storage all need significant improvement or complete redo. And what we discovered when we toured the stage is that because there is no storage, the risers for the choir and the acoustical shell for the band and the orchestra have to be stored right on the stage all the time, which impedes and restricts our use of the auditorium itself. In addition, there's no place to have another set of chairs and music stands so that you can easily use it as an instructional space. So we thought, all right, well, let's look at the spaces like around the auditorium and see if we can repurpose some of these. It's a big school. Well, we did that, and we found that it's a big school, but it's chock-a-block. There is no place around in the vicinity of the auditorium that could be repurposed to serve the auditorium needs without doing some sort of building extension. So we toured other middle schools, and we found out that their VPA programs were pretty right-sized, and they were, as a result, they were able to offer some additional VPA programs, such as musical theater that we can't do at SACS. We looked at the enrollment and determined it was continuing to grow, so these problems weren't going to go away. Then we sat down as a committee and we decided, well, what should we do? Should we just fix the box and leave these other problems, which will soon have to be addressed? or should we take a broader view of it at this early stage in the planning procedure? And so we decided that we would present two options tonight. So option one fixes the auditorium but doesn't address the storage needs or the classroom instructional space needs. Option two does everything that option one does and also expands and renovates the performing arts classroom and associated storage for the auditorium to right-size them for the existing and the predicted future enrollment. So the building committee, the Saks Auditorium Building Committee, unanimously recommended going forward with option two. But before we proceed any further, we want to take this to you, the Board of Ed, to find out if this is the kind of a program you would support. And so now I'd like to actually let you get into the details of it and introduce our consultants. So Jean Terone, who you know from the South School Project, is the president of SLAM Construction Services, and Kemp Morhart is an architect and principal of SAM Collaborative Services. So I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out and listening to us today. So what we want to talk about today, and Penny kind of summarized it for us, but we're going to take it to a little bit more detail, and hopefully at the end of the presentation, if there's any questions, you can certainly feel free to answer them.
Thank you.
There we go. Okay. So as Penny mentioned, you know, we have a SACSI Building Committee, and these are the members that Penny discussed. We're also, like Penny mentioned, we were hired to look at the project and help you guys along throughout this process. And the first thing we really wanted to do was really to get an understanding about what the scope of the work is. It's important, before you engage an architect, really to define what the project is so that we don't embark on something larger or get off track. So the whole purpose of the feasibility study was to figure out what we need, what the problems are, what we can fix, and how much it's going to cost. So that's kind of what we did. And in the process, so Kemp was brought on board to help us through that process. Kemp?
Thanks. Good evening. My name is Kemp Morhart. I'm a principal with the SLAM Collaborative, and I've been working doing public education design projects for the past 20 years or so of my career. Pleased to be asked to join this team. Part of our charge was to evaluate the existing conditions for the auditorium first and foremost, and then take a look at a feasibility study for some other options that we might look at for the building itself and for some of the program space that may or may not be available at this time. As we dove into the process, we looked at past reports that were developed by consultants that were hired by the town in the past, a theater consultant as well as an acoustic consultant. And we also included an MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing consultant on our team to come down and evaluate the building. And what we found is that the auditorium needs a little help. The building is in great shape around it, but the auditorium is circa the original building. It was overlooked in the 1997 renovation for, I'm not sure what reason, but maybe it was financial. So it's tired. The auditorium needs to be updated. There are several deficiencies with regard to the HVAC system. It's outdated. It's beyond its useful life. It's loud. So currently, the HVAC system needs to be shut off in order to do a performance in that space, in order to be able to hear what's going on stage. The acoustics were tested in some of those earlier consultant reports and found that both the ambient noise in the space from the HVAC system is 3 times what you would expect in a space of this type, as well as the acoustics as far as reverberation and time and so forth is not optimal for the type of performances that are going on in this facility. There are some other physical challenges as far as no catwalk in the upper attic space to access the theatrical lighting toward the front or the house lights to maintain them. And ADA accessibility in the main seating area is also challenged. There have been some provisions over the years that have been made toward the rear, but there are none toward the front, and the sloped floor is not up to current code for accessibility. We included a few pictures here just to show some of the conditions. The existing theater seating is again original. The cushions in many cases have holes in them or are ripped or torn and just essentially worn out. They are beyond their useful life. They're in the rear of the theater. There are some acoustic provisions that were made years ago with some pegboard that has since been painted over enough times where the holes have been bridged over and they're not performing as their original intent was. And there's also some challenges from electrical infrastructure, as you can see in the bottom right corner, where we've got some cords running across the floor, all of which would be improved in a renovation project. Some of the other challenges on stage, you can see the curtains are pretty worn and beyond their useful life. There's a fire curtain that will close down across the main proscenium in the event of a fire that is asbestos laden, that should be removed and replaced with something current. You can see on the bottom right corner, there's a note on the fly rigging to not use that particular rigging until you do something else. So there's some repairs that need to be done for safety reasons in that regard. Also in the control booth up behind the theater, the fire shutters that close off the windows for the lighting, the fusible links that control those are not operating, as far as I could see, the right way, and the shutters themselves are outdated, as well as the HVAC system in that space is also noisy, and you can see the blanket that's there on reserve to cover up the vent so they can hear what's going on. Backstage, Penny gave you a prelude to some of the challenges on stage where we have some storage problems. There's what I call stage storage risers on the far left picture, also acoustic shells that have to be stored on stage. And you can see right in that corner as well a work platform that is used to service the facility, also needs to be stored there. In addition to that, the center photo are sets for different stage productions. They're also stored on stage, and all of which is congesting the stage to make it not available for use, not to be available for use during school hours unless those things are moved out, put somewhere else, typically in the corridor or some other adjacent classroom, to allow the stage to be used for its purpose. And just a few more pictures. In the main auditorium, some of the paneling is coming off the wall, and there's just cosmetics in general. And in the upper attic, that's just a photo just to illustrate that there is no catwalk. During our discussions with the building committee, I think everybody in this room can understand and agree that this is a major space for the community. It's first and foremost for the school, for school assemblies and town hall meetings, as well as all the productions that are put on by all the grades in the school. But it's also a key community asset for after-hours use for different community groups, and as well as emergency services. It's part of, from what we understand, it's part of the emergency management plan for the schools to use this space as a gathering space for students. So it's a key space for the community and for the school. We always take a look back at where things started. This is the 1997 floor plan from the renovation of that era, and that particular project was designed for 1,200 students, and I would expect at that time that was a high projection, and for that student body, there were 5 music and performing arts classrooms that were designed. 1 being the orchestra classroom, 2 being the band classroom, 3 and 4 being 2 general music classrooms, and 5 being the choral. Fast forwarding to 2014, there are now 7 music and performing arts spaces, and those spaces have been carved out of other spaces. So therefore, for example, in the, I need my pointer. In the small room right off the entrance, used to be a conference room in the 1997 edition, is now a small band room for instructional purposes, as well as what used to be an office in this far corner in the south end is now an even smaller instructional space that will house anywhere from 4 to 6 students, but it was at one time an office. So the faculty and administration have made do with what they have, but there are some pressures that are adding to the need to expand some of this space. So as Penny mentioned, as part of our process, we'd like to understand how the users use the space and the facilities to understand what's important to them. We conducted a day-long interview session where we had multiple groups come through the meetings, administration, the theater and music faculty, emergency services from the town, district AV and IT specialists, as well as parent and community groups. And we wanted to capture what was important for all of those groups and users to include in the renovation of the auditorium. And what we found was not entirely surprising, but we found that we have a good-sized auditorium. It was originally a high school auditorium and stage, but it's in desperate need of full renovation of all of its systems, which would include lights, sound systems, HVAC, and everything associated with that. As I mentioned, it has poor acoustics. I think one of the major complaints we heard was that the sound system is poor. It's difficult for parents to hear their students play. There is not recording capabilities within the system. In addition, storage deficiencies are pretty severe. We showed you the pictures of the sets or the stage storage, but there is also a desperate need for set storage and actually a place to construct sets. I'll show in a minute that there is a space of that type in the floor plan that's been used, but it's jam-packed full of things, and so some sort of storage solution needs to be put into effect for that. There are no practice rooms. The current practice room that was designed in the 97 footprint is currently used as a storage room. So it's very tight for space, and as I mentioned, the music office was converted to a teaching space. Another thing that we found is that the existing visual performing arts classrooms are highly utilized. You're hard-pressed to find an open section during the day in those, especially the large ensemble instrumental spaces. The medium-sized classrooms have some capacity, but they are also highly utilized. And the storage deficiency for instruments is also present, where many of the instruments are being stored in the corridor and within the rooms around the perimeter, which exacerbates the pressures on those spaces. And here's a few pictures of that. Just some shots of the instrument storage down the west corridor, along the full length of the corridor. There are some dedicated instrument storage spaces, but they're very small, and they're not sized properly to accommodate the storage shelving in an efficient way. And also, as it turned out, as I walked through the building, lo and behold, one of the storage rooms had a sprinkler service inside of it, so that further diminished its capacity as a storage room. You can also see around the perimeter of the orchestra room, there are instrument stands around the perimeter, which cut into the space by anywhere from 2 to 3 feet all the way around the perimeter. Same thing happens in band. And as I'll get to in a couple of minutes, that really puts additional pressure on the free floor area to accommodate the students in an instructional capacity. So we base our approach on basic space standards. Up at the top, there's a chart of the State Department of Ed typical space standards for instructional space for a music program, which is where we start typically. I mean, that's the kind of the root of where we as architects practice. But over the years, we've found that slight tweaks to those standards need to be made in order to make the spaces functional. Excuse me. So we've based our studies on, for choral spaces, 25 net square feet per student or per seat, and group performance and instrumental classrooms at 32 square foot per seat. Taking those standards and applying them to the current floor plan, we see that if we were to apply those net square foot per seat standards to the current spaces you have, your current student capacity is 195 students. Now the breakdown here, the colored breakdown, starts with band room on the bottom, orchestra, and then choral, and then the two orange colored are the two general classrooms, which are functioning fairly well, actually, as far as the net square feet per seat. It's really the larger instructional or instrumental instruction spaces that are cramped. The chart to the left of the 195 represents how many students are being put into that space. So you can see the disparity between what the recommended area for, or recommended capacity for the spaces that you have are relative to what's being put in there. And as I mentioned, so if we look at the net square foot per seat that you currently have, in choral you're at 12 to 18, where we would recommend 25. Band is 17 to 24, depending on how many students are put in there, which we would recommend 32. And orchestra, similarly, we would recommend 32. What's driving this? There's an increasing enrollment. Since 1997, where we had 1,200 student enrollment, in 2014-15 you're at 1,292. It's projected to go up next year and in coming years up to 2021 to potentially increase by almost 200 more. As well as the enrollment, the program requires, the board requires that all 5th through 8th graders take the music program. So that puts pressure on the spaces. And there are a few other things listed here that we pulled together as a group that illustrate some of the ways that the administration has been dealing with that increased enrollment and that requirement. So as Penny mentioned, we have two options to show you tonight. Option one is to renovate the existing auditorium without adding any additional storage space or instructional space. Now we've done what we call a very high-level conceptual diagrammatic plan to assist the estimating process that Gene goes through to be able to put a price tag to what this project might be. These are not considered designs or detailed level designs. They're very conceptual in nature. But this information would be put out to bid for architectural services to inform the architect what the intent of the building committee is for the project. So this represents a full renovation of the auditorium space to address a few key items. Toward the rear, one of the other items that we heard through interviews with the group were that there were no light or sound vestibules at the main rear of the stage or rear of the auditorium, which was distracting to performers when on stage, and those doors are opened to the lobby. So this concept includes light sound vestibules at the rear. It includes re-raking the floor to be ADA compliant. It also includes adding handicapped wheelchair spaces at the rear on the two flanking sides, as well as in the center section, and as well as ADA wheelchair seats at the front. It also includes a cutout in the rear for lighting and sound control panels to incorporate a new state-of-the-art sound system and lighting control system. It suggests a way to improve the efficiency of the front of the stage, where the front of the stage is straightened out rather than the bow, and slightly reconfigured access to the stage to eliminate those two angled sets of stairs that currently come up onto the stage and allow one set of steps to serve two functions, one to get egress out, but also to get to front of stage access across the front. Excuse me. In addition to that, oversized doors will be installed at the rear of the stage on both sides. Currently, you have normal-sized doors, which makes it difficult to move sets and other stage items. New rigging, new fly system, brand new HVAC system. I think I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself looking at the scheme, but the important point here is that the supporting visual and performing arts spaces have not changed, and there has been no added storage space to accommodate the things that are currently being stored on the stage. You'll note up at the top here, there's a storage room, which is currently being used as the set scene building space as well as storage space. And as I mentioned, it's pretty jam-packed with things. So I was getting ahead of myself. This is the list of the improvements that would accompany option one. Obviously, improve the acoustic quality and install a new sound system. I'm not going to read all of these, but it's a full renovation, brand new HVAC systems that will be allow you to have ambient noise within the prescribed level for a space of this type. Energy efficient house lighting, LEDs, so they have long service lives. I mentioned the vestibules, improve the stage access and so forth. And I've already gone through what it doesn't do. The programmatic deficiencies that we're going to talk about in option two are not addressed in this option, as well as dressing spaces are not addressed in this option as well. Option two carries with it everything that is in option one, but then also takes a look at how to improve the pressures that we described in the instructional spaces, in the surrounding music program spaces, to address future enrollments in programs. So the schematic shows a small addition to the south side of the school, where we have single-story construction, and so it's easily facilitates a kind of a bump out of about 22 feet or so. And some of the parameters that we set up for ourselves was we did not want to realign any of the roads that were on the current site plan. So we kept ourselves within the free area, the grass zone between the sidewalk and the current building. And that's the area of addition, and reconfigured the spaces along the south edge to incorporate 3 large group performing instructional spaces. They're labeled choral, orchestra, and band, simply to placehold from the previous choral, orchestra, and band. And the art and STEM space that are currently residing in this zone of the building, there's an art room here and there's a STEM room here, would be relocated into the other spaces that are vacated by orchestra and band. The total area affected by this scheme is the auditorium and stage and some light reno space. Auditorium is about 8,200 square feet, including the stage. There would be light renovations that would kind of go on around that auditorium space proper, in the terms of maybe new flooring, new paint, so forth, as that renovation of the auditorium kind of bleeds into the other space, as well as possible some other minor renovations within these existing spaces. We kind of hint toward a dashed line through the STEM room, where that room might have a movable partition to be able to allow that to be split into 2, which would gain you yet another instructional space. And then what we term heavy renovation. I've kind of got an outline there for an area of the existing building that would be heavily renovated in order to make this, a scheme like this work, where you would, it would require structural modifications, HVAC modifications, architectural modifications. And that's of about 4,900 square feet. And then that red outline represents the new construction, the new addition parameters outside of the existing footprint. And that's about 6,200 square feet. So this scheme carries with it a total affected area of about 24,300 square feet or so. So it's far-reaching in its breadth, and it really brings a reasonable solution together for addressing some of the pressures in those spaces currently. Taking a little bit more of a detailed look, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on here, but I wanted to identify where you are existing in the left-hand column. The middle column is proposed, and then the difference, the new space difference, is the far right column in blue. And then I further identified with the red and gray arrows which ones are instructional spaces and which ones are storage spaces, because those are the two key problems that we're trying to resolve. But the bottom line is that this has a net increase of 5,400 square feet of instructional space, about 600 square feet of storage space, and the key point is 2 additional teaching spaces. And those group performing spaces are right-sized for the enrollment trying to be put into those spaces. I think I've already gone through most of this, but this just outlines the advantages and the components of option 2. And then, of course, we want to kind of come full circle and take a look at the seat capacity of the proposed. And if you recall, the 195 from the earlier slide as your current capacity based on the recommended space guidelines of your current spaces compared to the capacity of the proposed spaces of 338 students, which will be much more in line with the needs of the increased enrollment and program demand. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Gene, and he's going to talk a little bit about the costs for each of the options.
Okay, so focusing on option 1, which is really just the auditorium, and like we've all mentioned, and we're probably going to beat this one, is option 1 is strictly the renovation of the auditorium. It doesn't fully address the storage capabilities of the space. So this is really just renovating the auditorium and bringing it up to today's standards. So we just broke it into several categories, and the first one being just what's the cost of the work. So there's about $2 million worth of bricks and mortar, as you would call it. The concrete, the millwork, the HVAC, the lighting systems. There's another $1 million in just equipment that goes into an auditorium. As you can imagine, an auditorium is an expensive space between the acoustics, the sound systems, theatrical lighting, seating, and all those components that get put into the project. There's another $800,000 of contractors' general requirements, which basically deal with their insurance, their overhead and profit, general conditions to run a job, which are providing a super and project manager on site. And then we've also taken that and escalated the dollars to 2016, so we've accounted for the construction inflation that we can predict for the summer of 2016. The 566 number represents what we call soft cost items that deal with the architecture and engineering fees associated with doing the development of the plans and specifications. There's going to be some additional testing and inspections that we need to do as part of that cost. And then the last item that we always recommend, especially at this stage, since it's a feasibility study, is having a fairly comfortable contingency. Since this is strictly a feasibility study at this point, there's a lot of unknowns, so we want to carry money to basically account for that. So the phase 1 option one, I should say, about $5.3 million to do everything that we've described here and kind of represented as a good placeholder for budgeting standpoint. So option two is everything that we've described in option one. So here we are with a construction cost of about $3.2 million. Same thing, it's basically the bricks and mortar, everything that goes into the project. This obviously involves structural steel, it involves exterior renovation, site work. There's a lot more that goes into this because we are adding on to the building. General requirements are the same thing. The architecture and engineering fees, this is in addition to what you would pay in option one, so these are all add-ons to it. And same thing with the contingency. So these are all accumulative based on the cost of construction. A lot of these are multipliers. So there's another $4 to $5 million here. If you can see, if you add the 5.3 for option one, and the total cost of doing the entire project is about $10 million. So to make it sound a little better, we also looked at, so we do the auditorium, if there's a financial constraint, which everybody has to deal with, is that the auditorium is about $5 million. There's a benefit in doing it as one project because you can basically do the auditorium in about 9 months. It would take you about 11 months to do the entire project. So there's only a 2-month differential that the contractor's here on site. So anytime that there's an efficiency in what he's doing, there's obviously a financial benefit to do so. So the slide here is a scenario where if you decided to do only the auditorium in the 2016 school year and deferred the classroom wing to some later point, you're basically starting a whole new project. So there would be a 5.3 for the auditorium, a 6.5 to do the classroom wing at some future date. What you're doing is basically paying about a $1.6 million premium by doing that delay. So there is a financial benefit to do it all at once. It's less disruptive to the school. It buys it in today's dollars versus some future point, which we can't really predict at this point. And I think it's worth a consideration. So just to summarize everything, the study findings, we can all probably sit here today and walk out of here knowing that the auditorium renovation is justified. It's clearly visually and in need of some work. As part of this study that we did, we looked at the space to see, where can we do storage. This whole other project came about because of the need of the storage and the fact that the space is already constrained to the point where not only does it not allow for any future storage, but it also prevents current programs from functioning at its peak level. So the two options are at $10.3 million to do option two or option one at 5.3. The committee, as a group, recommended to proceed with option two. So that provides a fully renovated, fully functional auditorium and structural spaces for the current needs and projecting for the future needs of the space. It'll allow a lot of flexibility in the way programs are performed, and I think that increases the school's excellence in achieving future programs that currently may not be able to be offered because of space constraints. So the next steps that we would suggest, obviously, is to approve a project, whether it be option one or option two, by the Board of Ed and town bodies. Once that happens, our next steps for us is to basically solicit the architectural services to begin the true design work for the project. We also concurrently want to be able to get environmental consultant on board to do the plans and specifications for the remediation for 2016, if we can at all accomplish that, try to get the remediation work done during the summer. And the goal is to try to have the architectural plans done by the end of the year so that we can get out to bid in early 2016 for a projected start of 2016. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, Deanna?
Just a quick question on the option 2. If we were to go with that option, would we need to find, extra space to have those kids, because it's an 11-month project? So how do we have programming during the year? Do we need to rent portables? I mean, I don't, and have you looked at the costs with that if we have to have kids displaced or teachers displaced for a year?
Yeah, when we prepared the estimate, we looked at the phasing of the project, and if I can flip to that floor plan slide here. So the idea is to try to take this Coral Room, that's all new construction. So if you figure, let's say summer 2016, we're going to start the project. We can tackle this immediately, and concurrently, we can begin the foundation work and site work for this exterior portion and try to get this room finished as fast as possible. It's not going to happen in 3 months, it could be 4 months or 5 months. This will now become a new space that currently does not exist. We then will basically start switching programs in there so that we understand that the programs cannot have a disruption. So the idea is we're going to add a new space, move a program into it, renovate that space, and move a program back. So there's going to be a little bit of a snowballing effect that happens there to allow everything to basically function throughout the school year while we're doing the renovation. So that's all calculated in the process of the fees and the sequencing of the work.
Okay, thanks. Thank
Good
you.
question. Yep.
Yes, Sherry?
First, I just want to say thank you to the committee, because I know Penny and all the committee members have been putting in a ton of work on this, so thank you for that. And I know Greg has been spending a lot of time on this, and I actually have a question for Greg, if you can just provide us with a little bit of the student perspective in terms of how the two different options would meet our student needs.
So one of the visual takeaways is when we look at the floor plan now, what's considered the existing west wing is the lower part of the floor plan where there's a semi-oval. Those are my existing spaces where obviously we're overcrowded as they're undersized. Those new flexible and large performing group spaces on the south side are what will allow us to grow into the future. Right now, when you look at those 3 spaces, they can be perceived as interchangeable. Currently, the space restrictions do not allow me to run multiple grades at the same time in my music program. I can only schedule 1 grade at a time. With that flexibility, I could open up and schedule 2 grades at a time. What does that mean? Instead of the lack of music spaces driving the entire master schedule, it allows the master schedule to sit and meet the needs of all the other programs in the school in addition to music. The other thing I would point out is that right now, innovation and flexibility, let me say it the other way, innovation is restricted by the lack of flexibility. So most schools, as the committee went and looked at other middle school programming, most schools run choice programs in the arts. Students in the DRGA towns can take courses like musical theater in 8th grade. I can't dream about that until we build spaces that give me that flexibility.
Yes. Scott?
I have a couple of questions. One is sort of a clarifying question. You were good enough to give us your findings of seat capacity in the existing analysis and in option 2, but you didn't give us a seat capacity for option 1. So we currently have current use is 288. We should be at 195. If we renovated it as is in option 1, do we go up from the 195, or does that remain the constricting?
It remains the same because the option 1 does not address anything in these existing spaces.
Okay.
And so just to make sure that you understand the seat capacity slide, did I already pass by it? So that what we're trying to represent here is this is the recommended capacity for the spaces you have, and this is what you're currently
Yep.
putting in it. but it won't change for option 1 from where you are now.
Understood. So I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is, we all know we need to do something. And your project estimates don't contain any budget for the design, monitoring, and removal of hazardous materials.
Correct.
Hazardous materials that we assume are there, we know are there.
The hazardous materials are there.
Could you use the microphone, please?
Yeah, we're currently doing testing on that now. There is evidence of some, we just don't know the extent of it at this point.
So,
So what the idea is, Brian can speak to this more if he wants to, is to bring forward a separate emergency appropriation request to try and get the remediation done this summer, so that then we would have a clean box that we could go forward. And we don't have, I don't know what the costs for that are yet. That's
Do we have
for
a-
later in the month. No, I
Nothing.
don't think we have any idea.
There's not enough information at this
Not enough information. So that's why we said this is kind of concept. So these numbers are without those remediation numbers. And we understand that's a big gap, but that's just where we are at this point. And if,
Right.
Dr. Lutzy wants to add anything.
Well, just the main point is around timing. You know, it'll be important for us to do the remediation work in the summer of 2015. In order to do that, we'll be looking for an appropriation, so that we can hit that timeline, get out to bid, and get started right away.
but that doesn't change no matter what we do, whether we do option 1 or 2, the remediation work is the remediation work.
Right, it has to be.
That's correct, and I think what the estimate does incorporate is dealing with that from a reconstruction standpoint. So some of the monies that we've allocated for the project are helping, taking the worst-case scenario for some of these conditions and having to put something back in its place. So we've accounted for some funding for that.
So then my last question, for now, is, I guess, really for Greg. If I said to you the difference between renovating and the larger scope, between 1 and 2, is $5 million, if I said to you, here's $5 million to do anything you want with it, is this what you'd do?
Somehow I think there's a trapdoor.
Well, I mean,
I will be honest and tell you that when I saw the thinking evolve in the building committee, I was quite pleased, because one of the most frustrating legacies of the last building project, which I happily lived through from '97 to 2000, is that these issues weren't addressed, that the auditorium was value engineered out of the project, and therefore the spaces around, in terms of a vision for the music program, really never got their due diligence. So here we are almost 20 years later, trying to re-envision, frankly, some of the things that could have and probably should have been taken care of at that time.
Sherry?
So first, I just want to start with to say that I've got kids in this building, and my thinking, I clearly understand that we need to build capacity, and like you said, it makes sense to do that now to gain those efficiencies, those construction efficiencies. But when people see the jump from 5 million to 10 million, there's a question of can we build that capacity at a cheaper cost? So can you just give us perspective? And I know you're going to bid out the work, but are we putting in a Chevy here or a Cadillac or somewhere in between, and kind of give us that perspective on, I mean, to me, building the capacity now makes sense. I'd rather see us do this smartly versus be forced into a situation with portables in a couple of years. But, can we do it cheaper?
At this stage, I mean, as far as the auditorium goes, the misnomer is, you can do things less expensive, but the technology that needs to go into these spaces, the labor is the same. You can put in cheap parquet, or you can put in nice carpet. You can put in an expensive sound system or a cheap sound system. The labor is a constant. So it's really just the cost of the material, the longevity, the quality. So what we figured was probably the premium side of all the products to get the best. As it's for this state in the game, because we haven't really fully vetted this thing out completely. So the next stage is if an architect comes on board, we'll start to look at these systems and analyze them in a more thorough way to be able to decide a good, better, best scenario, what makes sense now. I think for this stage, we have to figure the best system. I mean, we all want the best, especially when it comes to the HVAC sound systems, because you're just going to be penny wise and pound foolish, because, like I said, the labor's the same. So half of the cost of what you do is in labor. It doesn't really matter what you put in, and 50% of it's labor cost. So that's the way we approached it. As far as the classroom side, I think that there really isn't a lot. They're boxes. They're large boxes. There isn't a lot of technology or a lot of high-end finishes in there. They're basically what we would carry a standard classroom, and we do these all the time. So these are what the industry is paying for these types of spaces right now. Our numbers are based on not being the low bidder. They're based on being number 2 or number 3.
Deanna?
Do you think that there's, we know we need to do the remediation work, and so that's going to be, I mean, I'm not familiar with how that occurs, but it sounds like there's a lot of taking things out, and do you think that there's room to move down in these numbers? Because you're basically, I would assume, with the remediation, going to be doing a lot of gutting of the auditorium, and, you know, is there maybe some movement in some of the demolition numbers that you have? And, you know, is there a way to do the remediation in such a way to bring down the costs of this, you know?
I would say there's always a way. I think, take the seating, for example. You know, their seating is high as $600 a seat, and we've seen it as low as $200 a seat. So there you go. There's a huge spread. So we split the difference. So maybe the $250 seat is something that's great. Maybe the $300 seat is something that's great. It's just something that, it's a placeholder right now. It's on the conservative side of the numbers. All our numbers right now are on the conservative side. So if you take it as a general rule, yes, there are ways, not necessarily to cheapen it, but to further refine it to make sure that our assumptions are correct so that we can bring the number down. There's almost $1 million in contingencies. There's $800,000 in contingencies. Some of that contingency is really just an estimating and design contingency. So once the architect gets on board and we've defined the scope a little better, we can say, okay, we can bring these numbers down now because we know more, and we can better define and better start to count what we really need. So there's also scope, like you mentioned. So one example there would be the ceiling in the auditorium. There's a possibility that we can leave that ceiling in place. And then there's the possibility of not having to put a catwalk in there. So we've kind of covered both of those. If we don't have to put a catwalk in there and we can access everything from the ground to get to lighting and lighting controls, there's a fair chunk of money right there that we can save. So there's a lot of things that just have to be further developed in order for us to get closer to those numbers. I don't want to go up. I want to go down.
Can I just ask for a detail on what you were just saying about getting the lighting from the ground? If I understand it correctly, we now do the lighting from the ground, and it has to be done with a machine that's rented and brought in at great expense. You're
Correct.
not meaning that, are you?
Well, no, I'm just saying that technology, as far as LEDs,
Yes.
you probably won't have to get up there.
Okay.
Energy efficiency, they produce a lot less wattage, requires less HVAC systems. If you don't have to get up there to service those, maybe ever, that's a huge savings right there. If there's a way that they can be controlled, what there will be a way that they can be controlled on the ground, so that they don't have to be adjusted up top there and try to do follow spots up on the area up there, then those are all things that help benefit the overall cost and how we accommodate the future construction of that space. So we just don't know what those parameters are right now. But right now, they're using the lift.
Hazel,
Yes.
the process
There
okay.
it goes.
The process that we followed mirrors the process that we used for the South School Windows project, which is, as you're in the feasibility area, you really need to consider all things and be your most conservative possible. As you start bringing on design professionals to truly get into all of the details that go into a facility like this. Then you can start making those contrast types of things. So as Jean and Kemp have both said, the goal was to start at a point where we have a feel for what is the maximum cost for option one, what is the maximum cost for the combined option two, and oh, by the way, if we do option one and then it's decided down the road to do option two, not only do you have a 1-year inflationary issue, if it's decided 2 years, you need to include additional inflation to that point. So that as we presented to you on South School and to the funding bodies, the only direction we intend to go is down, but you have to have a clarification of scope, of definitions, all of those things. That will require funding in order to hire that design professional, do further research on it. So again, we're at probably the 30,000 feet level. We'll swing down to the 15,000 foot level, and then ultimately we're going to get into the weeds.
Just one more point on the cost side, we've, not only did we do an estimate on it, but we also used comparative analysis on a project that was recently completed that we designed and built ourselves. So similar project, similar auditorium, the only thing that was different was the seating capacity. It was eerily similar. So we have real data based on 2012 costs of what that project cost us. So we used a lot of that to say, okay, here's what we figured, here's what we just did, how does it look, what are the differences and what are the similarities. So that was part of the analyzing that we did to come up with the numbers that we came up with.
Jean.
Jean, could you speak to the time frame for two items? One is the all the work at the auditorium. In other words, how long will that take approximately, knowing what you know now? And I assume it'll be totally out of commission once that starts till it's basically done. And B, how much time, if you start in June of 2016, how much time will it be to the completion of the renovation of the existing / new rooms?
Yeah, we're basing the auditorium renovation about 9 months, and I want to caveat that in that there's a lot of long lead items in that order. So the part of my responsibility to the committee would be to make sure that we're putting it out to bid in a timely manner so that when we hit the summer, we have everything that we need. So the idea is to start in the summer, do the worst work in the summer, the most disruptive work in the summer. About 9 months later, we'll have the auditorium up and operational. The addition, again, if it's concurrent with the auditorium work, is going to follow suit. So by the following August of 2017, the space will be ready to be occupied and set up.
Other questions? Allison?
Actually, a question for Greg. I just want to clarify, if I heard you correctly, did you say that the master schedule for the entirety of SACS is driven off of the limitations that you have for this program?
That's correct.
So if we go with option one, you're going to continue to be restricted as you currently are?
Yes, option one provides a benefit to the footprint in the auditorium, but it doesn't provide any additional flexibility in terms of programming for students or scheduling the rest of the day for students in the way that I previously described.
So if you were not limited by this space, this lack of space, how would you be building your master schedule? In other words, I'm trying to get some idea in terms of, I'm assuming it's quite limiting to you, but I'm just trying to get some idea of how limiting it is.
Certainly. I guess the best example is if you think about our program, we have one strings teacher, one small strings room, but a strings program in grades 5, 6, 7, and 8. So that's the very first person who has to be scheduled before I can schedule the rest of the school. And so it's somewhat frustrating, as you can tell, in terms of building in these efficiencies. Can we continue to do that? Yes, we have to, if that's the decision that gets made. Is it the best way to schedule a middle school with 1,400 students coming? I think we know the answer.
Okay, and also just in terms of capacity, basically, if we're looking up there, we currently have capacity for 195, right, square footage-wise. I just want to make sure I've got this right. But we're currently serving 288 students, correct? We're looking at option 2, building an additional 50, capacity for additional 50 students. I think it was up to 338, right? Despite the fact that we're anticipating an increase in student population of 117, I think, over the next 6 years. So clearly, we're not looking to I guess the question will always be, are we overbuilding? And clearly, it looks like you're taking a little bit more of a conservative approach to this, so there's no chance that we're overbuilding. If anything, it's going to be maybe a little bit tight at the end, but something that we can deal with. Do I have all those numbers correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Sangeeta?
Yeah. I just wanted to, bring in, working on the committee of just between option 1 and 2, just looking at the auditorium, if we just fix the option 1, we've got a great, nice auditorium, but again, that storage issue is critical. And so when you're making an investment, $5 million is not anything to sneeze at. It's a good amount. And so if you put in $5 million, and you're still going to have a lot of people dissatisfied because it's not going to be optimally functional, because you can't use it, stage is not available, there's all this risers and things in the back. You're starting out, you're going to put $5 million and not be completely happy with even just auditorium being used in its efficient manner. And then as we kind of looked into these other side spaces, again, as us being on the Board of Ed, we're looking at, are we having good space utilization? And, there's a concern, that we're already overcrowding, and we're going to be looking to overcrowd these spaces even more. And adding this flexibility this time, with considering that savings, is just something, again, I want to just point out to you that, when you're considering these two options, that's really essential, as we're looking at, what's the best function for getting the school to work efficiently, and then and the limitations that option 1 really is going to be placing on us, and having, after invested $5 million, are we going to come back and say, why didn't we do more? So,
Do it at once. Jen?
I just want to ask, kind of what Sangeeta said, and this is a question to Greg as well. I know if with enrollment projections are heading up, and class sizes, we seem to be borderline in some of the grades as far as classes are concerned. These extra classrooms that you're in the option 2 that you're looking to add, is this going to be more of like a art wing, VPA wing, or are some of the classes that are overloaded? Can you just talk about that maybe a little bit? If I know you've got teachers in closets, with offices, and that one of the lounges is now a classroom. Is that going to all be shifted so that maybe some of the wings, like the 5th grade wing, isn't as crowded, or?
The option 2 spaces that are projected in the design will accommodate the music programming up to 1,400 students. So the benefit that you're foreseeing is when we get over that hump someday, and as enrollments start to level off, that's when I can recapture some of those smaller classrooms in that west wing for non-music purposes. But in the next 5 to 10 years, I wouldn't anticipate that enrollment would allow us to do that. So option 2 is, as Mrs. Badula was mentioning earlier, isn't an overbuild. It's keeping up and catching up with our enrollment surge and anticipating the need to continue to innovate within the music programming, because you can tell our existing spaces haven't been able to accommodate successfully all the things our kids are capable of being scheduled for.
Are there any other questions that anyone has? I think yes, Sherry.
It's really more of a comment, but I'm wondering if it would be helpful in this presentation to actually footnote the cost of portables, because like we've all been saying, based on our enrollment projections and our capacity issues, we need additional capacity. So this is, in my mind, the preferred route. But if we don't go this route, which is actually building a long-term asset that we can use and hopefully, even repurpose and do lots of creative things with, that's going to expand our learning, our student learning. But if we don't do this, we are going to still have to spend some money. And so I just want to make sure that, the decision makers are clearly thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a net value here, because if there is a need to put portables in, you're going to spend $1 million or some amount of money. It's going to be in another location, and we all know portables aren't temporary. They tend to be permanent fixtures at schools.
And then they have to be torn down at great expense also.
Yeah.
And in today's world, security concerned world, it's.
Yeah, and ones that we've seen are always, you walk outside to walk inside, and that becomes a disconnect between the schools, especially in a music program. It really, it's something that has to be really looked at closely. But from a cost standpoint, yes, you have to weigh that into the cost of not doing this. You're still going to spend some money to do something.
Yes, Scott?
In the schematic for all the options, there's a large courtyard, 4,421 square feet, that sort of sits between the current art rooms and what is, I guess, a hallway.
Yes.
Is that used for something? Did we look at that space?
You don't have that picture, do you? We actually looked at that space.
Yeah, we did look at that as a potential for adding 2 classrooms in there off of that courtyard. Well, basically taking half the courtyard. It's very expensive space to do that. So we ended up pulling it out of the program. It would have given us 2 more questions.
I guess let's first clarify what your initial question was. You were asking if that courtyard was used as a courtyard space or as an outdoor classroom?
Could it be used for additional, some of this additional classroom space that we're looking at building out on the front? Would that be
Okay.
My thought was maybe it'd be less expensive, not a more expensive option.
Then yes, we did look at it. It is costly because you're hovering materials into a courtyard over an existing structure and so forth. But it was, we did look at that as an option.
Good enough.
Allison?
Greg, I imagine there's a little bit of a safety issue that's involved with this also. When I look at these pictures of the halls lined with instruments and bags, and we look in the overcrowded music rooms lined with large instruments all around the way, I'm just wondering, in terms of putting another 100-plus students into that building and into that area, I imagine that's something that obviously you want us to consider also in terms of making this decision, because to Sangeeta's point before, to spend $5 million and still continue to have a safety issue and continue to have the overcrowding issues is something I would think would be of great concern to you.
I think the slide that pointed out that standard for space in terms of the recommended net square footage for these programs tells the story. And you can tell from the photos the existing conditions that we face in order to run the programming that we're trying to deliver. So we're doing the best we can. We're being overcrowded and undersized, and we'll continue to do the best we can. If relief comes, it comes.
I had a question. I didn't know if anyone, and perhaps Dr. Lutzy or someone might know, is there any federal or state money that might be available to help and offset the cost?
This would be eligible for a state educational grant. At least portions of it would be. Yeah, because it's a program requirement. The district would have to develop an ed spec to support it, put it in a grant application, and it was our understanding that that's what would happen if it were to go forward. And I believe the reimbursement rate is approximately 20% for whatever's eligible.
And the eligibility piece is always the critical piece. And so on renovation, construction, you could probably factor about 50% ineligible. So at a minimum, you could probably estimate about a 10%. So $1 million would be the starting point in terms of state grant.
Those have not been accounted for in the numbers. So that would be all.
Does the group feel at a point that you're ready to do this as a first read?
Hazel, what is it that the committee is looking for from the board at this point?
we need to, do you want to explain about where we are on the schedule?
We're looking to understand between option 1 or 2, what the board would support, so that we can build it into the budget going forward as a capital item, as we move it forward to the Board of Selectmen on the 21st and beyond that. So looking for the support for the Board of Ed to make a decision or to consider option 1 and/or option 2, and to support that going forward to the rest of to the other town bodies.
Okay, thanks.
So do you need a motion, or how do you proceed on that?
First, for first.
That's okay.
Motion.
You are going to be considering the capital budget as the third item on the agenda. Last week, I had mentioned that we had created a placeholder for this project at $4 million because at that point in time, we didn't have extensive dollars and cents, and we felt that putting just an arbitrary figure out there without having this kind of a discussion wouldn't have made any sense. So as we discuss later on, the board could provide direction to the administration, and then ultimately you will vote on the 20th for your general fund budget, your 3 capital budgets on a going forward basis. So it will become the Board of Education's recommended budget that moves forward to the town.
So it's a first.
So you can kind of hold off until item 3.
So it's a first read.
We can look at it when we do the capital.
Okay, so we can look at it when we do the capital budget, if the group feels comfortable with doing that. Any other? Okay. That was a terrific presentation for us.
Thank
We really appreciate the questions and the leadership of Penny Ration and all of the things that you've told us on here to give us really the information we needed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would
And
you-
I think that Penny has a few extra slide presentations. Okay, I know that there's several people who were looking for them.
Thanks for your help with this.
Do you want to introduce Mr. Rinaldi? Yes, okay. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, I asked Dr. Let's see if you would introduce our next speaker, please.
Sure. Next up, we have Steve Rinaldi, who's come to speak with us once again about insurance. As you recall, back in December, Steve shared with us some information about our insurance plan and its performance, and we had lots of questions and asked for him to please come back. He agreed, which is always good news. Tonight's conversation, this is to help us with our decisions around management of the insurance, to have an opportunity to see about the performance of our plan and how we're doing and the reserve and other things, and to ask Steve some questions that'll help us make a final determination about our budgeting for the Board of Ed's budget prior to the 20th. So Steve has prepared us, I think, with some handouts that are coming around. And you also have some other handouts in the pile here. So these will come around first, and Steve will take us through them.
Wait here. Here's one more. Here's one more.
Okay. Okay. There's another one over there.
Okay.
Okay.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So these first two exhibits are the same exhibits that we talked about last time we were here. I just wanted to kind of review the numbers with you as we have a discussion about the reserve and any possible use of the reserve. So looking at Exhibit 1, just to again summarize kind of where we are in FY15, looking at that right-hand column, we're expecting total costs of about $14 million. You have revenue of $3.1 million. So we expect total net cost to the board to be 10.9. Remember, you budgeted at 10 million, intentionally budgeting below what was expected so that you would intentionally draw down the reserve. At this time last year, we thought we would be drawing down the reserve at about 900 to 950, and that's what appears to be happening 6 months into the year. If we take the costs from FY15 and project them into next year, kind of that column right to the left, that total column, just to kind of summarize quickly, we believe we need about 11.6 million. The budget is 10 million, as we just mentioned, for an increase of 1.6. Right below that, had we budgeted at 10.9, what was requested at this time last year, the needed increase would be about 700,000, or about a 6.5% increase. So in health insurance world, things are running pretty well. They're running pretty much as expected, a little bit below what was projected last year. So things are running well. The issue, this $1.6 million issue, is primarily a function of intentionally underfunding so that you draw down the reserve. The second page, the second exhibit, you've also seen before. This is kind of taking a look at what the reserve is, what it's likely to be as you go into next year, and what, if anything, you should do about that. So kind of if we walk down maybe that middle column, the projected FY15, 14-15 year, we have total expected expenditures of 14 million, revenue of 3.16 for net cost of 10.9, budget's 10 million. We're going to draw down the reserve of 924. Now remember, this is a projection at this time with just 6 months of claim experience. The ending reserve as of fiscal 14 is that 3.795 number. So we're drawing that down by a little less than $1 million. So we're going to end up with 2.87 if these projections hold. Now, historically, the board has always wanted to maintain that reserve to potentially fund two items, one item being the IBNR reserve, the other being the stop-loss corridor, the gap between what the expected claims are and what the stop-loss level is. So in the current year, FY15, that number is 3.8. So this is really the first year where that reserve is going to be below the capacity to fund those two items, and that's attributable to that new facility that you negotiated with the town. I believe that the document was just handed out. So
Can I speak to that for just, let me just, if you look on in the documents that you have, it says Board of Education Insurance Reserve Policy. It's 3-hole punch there. Do you want to speak to the specifics?
Right. You may recall that the town council approved this new policy after multiple sessions of discussions and the reserve aspects as it relates to risk and managing the risk fully by the Board of Education or sharing that risk directly with the town. So we made copies of this. You can see that it's actually the signed policy. It was really wonderful results of the dialogue between the board and the funding bodies.
So the value of that document for the current fiscal year is about 2.145 million. So clearly sufficient to fund the deficit between what your reserve is going to be and those two items that historically you've always funded it. Now, as we move into FY16, the column to the right, again, we think your net costs are going to be 11.6 million. Your starting reserve would be that 2.87, the same as the ending reserve for the current year.
If in fact you budget at 11.6 and costs come in at 11.6, then there would be no change. There would be no further drawdown. So the reserve that you have on the books would be the 2.87. You would be wanting to fund those same two items, the IB&R reserve of $1 million and that corridor of a little under 3, that 2.89. So in effect, you need $4 million if the board continues its policy to want to assure itself that those two items can be funded under any circumstance. So obviously, the reserve, again, is insufficient, but the value of that reserve facility that the town is offering or that you've negotiated is the 2.22. So essentially, you need that $4 million. You have 2.87. You're short 1.14, but the town is making available 2.2. So there's basically $1 million potentially available to reduce that reserve further if, I presume, there's pressure to reduce the 11.6 budget recommendation. So if in fact FY15 ends as projected with a $920 or so thousand drawdown, then there's the potential, if you treat the town's that reserve facility almost as cash, then there would seem to be about $1 million available to reduce the budget. However, that's a big if, because we're only 6 months into the current year, and that 950 might be 1250 or some bigger number. So perhaps at this point, you might want to consider some portion of that $1 million as you proceed, with this process. Maybe half of that, or probably be fairly safe. And again, assuming that you assume that the town facility is equivalent to cash, meaning it could be immediately accessed if it were needed in the event of a claim deterioration, which I presume it would be. The final exhibit is really unrelated to all of this. One of the questions that came up had to do with what was the savings associated with the HSA program relative to what you had assumed in the budget for FY14. So just very quickly, if we took your existing PPO costs as of FY13, assume that all of that stayed the same, and then just trended it into FY14, that's what we would want to compare the actual FY14 results. So your PPO plan probably would have cost a little under $4.6 million if you didn't do anything in that collective bargaining process, but you did. You negotiated this dual option HSA plan. So we know the actual cost for that, net of employee contributions. We know that the HDHP, the high deductible health plan, ran at about 2.9. It was HSA costs of $500,000. The net PPO cost after contributions were $813. So in total, the actual dual option plan that was negotiated in that bargaining session resulted in costs of $4.24, so saving about $350. The budget projection assumed something like 2.25, so the plan ran better than anticipated, fortunately. That represents about 7% or 8% of what your costs would have been. So another way to look at it is that negotiating session reduced your cost by 7 or 8%. Could you have accomplished that in any other manner, not going in this direction? For example, if you kept the PPO and increased employee contributions and the copays, could you have gotten to 7 or 8%? And the answer almost certainly is no. So, good job. Any questions on the reserve? I'm kind of flying here, I have a feeling.
It's a lot of information, a lot of numbers, and back and
I know.
forth and all of that.
Yep.
So we might need to take a minute to digest it. But I think it is very important for us to consider where we are with the reserve and comfort levels around that, because as you know, this is the single largest number in our budget at a $10 million number. This is in the budget that was presented last week. It's a $1.6 million increase. It's the 16%, which is the fully funding, which, as we talked about before, as an initial budget to show the true actual costs as we go. But looking at the numbers we have here, looks to be about a little over $1 million in excess funding if we look at this policy and and put them together in that way. The policy does speak to instant access or very quick access to the money. I know that was a significant concern in the past that, given the way that appropriations work and the need for a read and a second read going through them, that the Board of Ed wouldn't have access in time. So the policy does cover that and talk about notification to the other boards after the appropriation were made instead of, prior to that. I have a concern, of course, there's a part of me that says, let's push really hard to get the whole $1 million. But then it says, and then next year, what does that look like? So I think in the context of budgeting and planning, it's important to think about, as we talked about last week, smoothing out the tech lease so that instead of being up and down, it's about $150,000 year to year and a predictable cost as we look at it. I think of this in some ways similarly, that thinking about smoothing it out a little bit, still be an increase, but not to use it all and then pay that piper all at once and try to phase it in. So, add $1 million. And so I guess, Steve, a question for me would be, if, let's say we use the $1 million, then would it then be likely that we would we could be, sounds like a little slightly underfunded in this going forward, but highly unlikely there would be excess capacity in that reserve then for the FY17 budget.
Right.
Et cetera.
And that you would be facing the 16 to 20% increase because you'd have to make up that one-time funding, yes.
Right, because it's being used to supplant the budget and doing that. So I guess I'm, interested in feedback around that, thoughts with this in front of us and
We
that
got a couple
discussion.
hands up. Scott?
I'd make two comments. One is that I think Steve points out a very important point, which is, do we consider the policy to be like cash? And I would encourage my fellow board members to think of it exactly that way. I think we negotiated, I think, Nancy and her team and with guidance from the board did an excellent job of negotiating a document that gives us security, and that we should think of that money as part of our fund. But I agree with you to turn all $1 million back at this point when we don't know what the second 6 months looks like is probably not prudent. I don't know where I would be comfortable, but I don't know that I'd be comfortable in the entire, turning the entirety of it. But Steve, I did have one question for you, which is, if I said to you, within the confines of the agreement that we have with our teachers, can we find savings somewhere without violating our agreement, without changing, we've promised the teachers a certain program, we want to deliver everything we promised them. Are there savings to be found in the cost of the insurance?
I think the two most promising things, and there are initiatives to address both of those. We mentioned last time this dependent verification eligibility audit. So there is a process in place, an RFP is put together, a vendor will be identified to conduct that audit relatively soon. And so to the extent that there are any ineligible dependents on the plan, that process should result in a reduction. And typically across the state in school district settings, minimally, that process pays for itself, at least, typically some multiple of the cost associated with it. So that's one initiative. The other is to market the stop-loss programs, not the program overall. We're a little late to do that, and there's not a great deal of potential promise in that. You're a large plan. There's no evidence that the Cigna discounts are inadequate relative to any of the other vendors. However, bidding the stop-loss program probably makes sense, and so we're going to proceed to do that to see if there's an opportunity there. It's a pretty big chunk of your fixed costs right now. So those are the two most promising areas in the absence of renegotiating any provision of the plan.
Great, thank you.
That's good. Any other? Yes, Deanna?
This is actually a question for Nancy. So if we're going to look at that town guarantee as cash, do you get a monthly report, some kind of statement that shows what those reserves are? I mean, I think if we want to look at them as cash, there has to be some sort of insurance on that.
I actually have read access to our health bank account. I've been working up using last year's bank statement in terms of tracking both claims and deposits and those types of things, and I'm through December of 2014 on this year's, so we can monitor that. Again, the ability to also interact with the CFO of the town so that I'm clear on additional dollars that she's pulling from a different reserve that I do not have any view of. And that if she's going to pull those down, she would need to let me know about that. And just as we transmit things like wire transfers to her, then that kind of communication could easily take place. So I'm not concerned about that. Again, it requires monitoring at a minimum on a monthly basis, but really probably twice a month you'd want to really look at that. The deposits that she makes into the account, even though, for instance, we have a $10 million budget, she's making them in $500,000 increments as she monitors and keeps that account somewhere chattering around $500,000. So, you know, if it hits about in the high 400,000s, she'll deposit 500,000 into it. So, again, it's at the point beyond which we do not have any budgeted money for this particular object, or as we get close to our budgeted amount, that we would have a concern.
Sangeeta?
And I agree with you know, what Scott is saying. I think, you know, we've got this extra $1 million, but you know, we've been very aggressive with our healthcare plans, which obviously has been paid off because we've gotten this extra $350 we've been able to save. But on this side, I feel like we need to be a little conservative and not give the whole $1 million, because we don't know where we'll end up, as you know, Scott mentioned. And we're still kind of new with this. I mean, there's still, you know, we've got teachers and different plans on different types of things, and we're still kind of fielding it out. So I know you said that, you know, at 500,000 that was pretty, you know, comfortable. So I would suggest something around that, you know, rather than the whole $1 million, excess of, you know, just doing the $500,000, where, you know, again, we're kind of bridging that reserve and kind of looking to see where we are with how all the plans come out towards the end of the year, and then kind of give us a little bit of working room too for next year, depending on how things turn out. So that's where I would consider.
How does the rest of the board feel about that? Any other thoughts about that? Yes, Jean?
I would think it's impossible to give the $1 million because, as we've been told by Steve, that this is a projection, we're only halfway through. So I would effectively go with the $500,000 number.
I saw Penny's hand go up simultaneously.
Well, and also, what I wanted to check with is, with respect to the reserves, is it's starting next year that everybody goes into the HSA, right? We still have some people in the PPO this year?
I don't believe there's any requirement that everybody go into the HSA. There is a change in the HSA plan. There's a prescription drug copay scheme that goes in place FY16, but I don't believe it's
No? Okay, so the two plans still continue. Okay. Well, I guess, you know, I think it's a decision that we ought to make in consultation with the town bodies, because the problem is, every time we draw down these reserves, we are basically a little bit artificially budgeting. We're doing it all knowing that we're drawing down the reserves, but we're always creating a huge problem for the next year. And in fact, I mean, we went from drawing, you know, fiscal year 14, we drew down $734,000 from the reserves. Last year, this fiscal year, we're projected to draw down $900,000, creating a, you know, kind of a bigger gap. So it's going in the wrong direction in terms of getting to, you know, what you might call a prudent budgeting, which is, these are my costs. We already have the reserves that we think, you know, they're going to be, and going forward. So my thought would be that to kind of smooth that out, you know, to understand where we are, we need to, the town bodies need, if we move that, the town bodies need to know that we're creating a $500,000, bump up for last year, just like everybody knew that the insurance number this year was going to be a huge bump up from last year because it got dropped down to take $900,000 out of the reserves. So, I mean, part of me says just leave it at 1.6 million now, and then let's have a conversation, and we'll figure, or leave the 1.1 million in now, and so leave the $1.6 million increase, and then we'll have a conversation about what we can do to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to these additional reserves. Because I want to make certain that the town is comfortable with all the town bodies are comfortable with the same arrangement.
So you're saying hold on, not make
Well,
a decision
I would say
now?
hold on and have it as a point of discussion with the town bodies as to what it should be, how they want to smooth out that increase. We're eventually going to have to start, budgeting for what our health insurance costs actually cost us.
Yes. Oh, Nancy.
There's one other handout that I created from the 5 audited financial statements of the town. It's this landscaped material, and you can see the balance sheet for, and again, these are the audited records for 2010 through 2014. So you can see the net assets on page 1, beginning with about $4.9 million through June 30, 2014, as the $2.767 million. Then on the next page, you can see basically the income statement, where back in 2010, there was a positive net change in assets, 420,000, then 241, then a negative 600, then a negative million, then a negative 700,000. So again, you can see where the dialogue between the town and the board began about drawing down the reserve. So you can see this very visually in terms of that dialogue and when it began and the results of it. And then the statement of changes in cash is the third one. So again, you can see the pluses and minuses. But I thought that that might help as a visual cue for you to look at as well.
Jean.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that while it appears we're withdrawing, if we were to say to go to 500,000 versus $1 million, that it appears we're drawing down our reserve. We are, but we also have to recognize again, if I'm interpreting this correctly, that the town is putting forth the $2+ million in quote cash. So the total reserve between the two, ours and the town's, is not going down.
Right. And that's
It has
why it's
gone up.
important to have this policy. And this is a real positive result of all of the discussions, the multiple meetings that were conducted throughout last budget season. And I would agree, you should be able to treat this as cash. It's simply sitting on the opposite side of, in the town's budget, in a reserve account, as opposed to in the board's account.
Deanna?
I would tend to agree with Penny and hash this out in the budget process, because I think either side, the dollars are what the dollars are. And it's either coming out of the town's budget or it's coming out of our budget. And, the dollars aren't going to change, and it's not going to make a net change to the overall tax bill to taxpayers. But I think the discussion with the town bodies and having it in an open forum is instructive. And I think that it probably is not prudent to do that yet. That would be my opinion.
And I agree. I think this does need to be vetted out through all the town bodies. I guess for me, I was just like, what is our starting point? And whether we start off at that, where we are at the full amount, or do we have, an in between that we're still going to work out and vet out more? I think that's what I was thinking of. And I can definitely see both sides of it, of, when you do it, because at the end of the day, it is something that we're going to have to do in combination with all the town bodies.
Scott?
I'd bring up one more point that we need to keep in the back of our mind, which is that reserve keeps rising. Because while the IBNR is pretty much a constant, the stop loss is a percentage of the total claims. It's 25% of the total claims. And as the claims go up by 6 or 8 or 10 or more percent, depending on the year that we look at, so must our reserve go up by 25% of that number. So our reserve need went up by, what, a couple $100,000 between this year and next year. It's going to continue to go up by that. So even as we give back what we give back out of use what we use out of our fund, we need to make sure that we don't get into a situation where we have nothing in our fund and then need to increase our fund by the $200,000 increase as well. So if we said 500, it's really 300, the minute we turn over the calendar. So we got to kind of keep that in the back of our mind as well, I think.
Do you think it's important you'd rather do it in the dialogue rather than for us to have a plan at this time? Is that what you're saying?
That would be I don't know if you need a motion, but I think it's a very constructive process to have. It was a constructive process to have last year, and I think we all need to go through it. That would be my recommendation, is that it's a very open, constructive process with the town, and we all, weigh in.
Yes,
Yeah,
Sherry.
I would also agree with what Penny and Deanna are saying, and I'm laughing here because we actually have now added a layer of vocabulary to our insurance, which is excess funding. And I do think that, I know there's an insurance meeting already scheduled coming up with the town funding bodies, and I think it would be appropriate to have that discussion with the town funding bodies and the insurance experts on what is an appropriate level of excess funding. And even maybe to think about drafting that into policy form. I think there should be some consistency to that excess funding over time. And I think having the insurance experts input into that in terms of what's the appropriate level of risk to be taking on is important. But again, I think that we have a collaborative, approach set up, and we should use that process to discuss this.
Allison?
I agree. I think what we have to be careful of, though, is we've been living off the good years for a long time, and so we've been drawing down these reserves, and I think everyone's talked about the fact that we haven't had an accurate number here, an honest budget number for the cost of our insurance. In agreement with the town, we've all agreed to do this, to draw down the reserves, but as we've said for the last couple of years, they're only going to last for so long. And I know last year we made a couple changes also in trying to create some savings around our insurance. I think the individual stop loss went from 100 to 300. Is that correct, I think?
Yep.
I was just curious what the implications of that were. I don't know if you have the numbers in front of you now, but I know you said basically we saved about 7% or whatever. We did well in terms of the entire plan. But in terms of some of the individual decisions that we made last year, were those beneficial to us, or?
Well, I think last year we actually kind of got hurt by that. We had quite a few claims that were in that 100 to 300 gap that all of a sudden we're not hitting the stop loss level. And so I think if you compared the additional claims to the premiums, we kind of lost that, although this year it looks like we're benefiting from that. So there's been an improvement in large claims somewhat, so I think we're benefiting from that right now. If it'll completely wash out from last year, I don't know at this point. It probably will, but
Okay, because I know one of the things we've always benefited from, I think, as a board, is taking a more conservative stance on the insurance. And I think it's easy to get complacent because we've been successful. I think it's always worked out for us. But at some point, it's not going to. And I think what Scott was basically saying too is we don't want to get hit in some year where all of a sudden we're going to have to ask for maybe a significant increase out of the blue. So I guess I'm also trying to get a feel in terms of what would it take for us to say have $1 million in unexpected costs in our insurance?
3 sick people. Not a great deal.
It wouldn't take that much, correct? Right, it wouldn't take that many people to do that. So I think that's something we have to be careful of. We talk about $1 million as this really large number. We talk about even like excess funding or whatever, or saying we have an extra $1 million, but it wouldn't take very much for us to all of a sudden be $1 million in the red. And I think we just have to be very, very careful of that.
Just to give you some idea, your monthly claims just in the last 6 months have variated from 500,000 to 1.1. So just to give you an idea of, as you get into May and June and you're wondering, Are we going to hit our budget? Well, is it going to be a $500,000 month or a $1.1 million month? I mean, that's the kind of variance that you have month to month. So it's a very volatile type of thing. The dynamic you were describing is correct, that this corridor is going to, unless you start making changes to the aggregate stop-loss corridor level, which we talked a bit about last year, you might remember. But that number, you know, despite everything that's been done at the federal level and to some extent the state level, healthcare costs continue to rise and are projected to rise for the foreseeable future. A nice feature of the agreement, however, is that it's a percentage of the corridor.
Right.
So that number grows in value as that corridor rises sort of automatically. Doesn't fully cover it because it's only 40%, but.
Right, and I think this is a new piece to the puzzle for us as a board, and we have to get comfortable with this in terms of making changes, you know, that we've been consistent, we've basically been relatively consistent with our policy, but this enables us to be perhaps a little bit more flexible with that, and that's where I think that dialogue maybe with the town comes in, that we're all on the same page and all understand exactly what this means in terms of our decision-making. But I would be hesitant to really change that number significantly until we're all comfortable with that.
I think that I'm seeing shaking heads, yes.
So, Steve, just while you're here, so that we can, when we think about the individual stop-loss number that we went to, because we did a really big jump last year. We went from $100,000 individual stop-loss to $300,000, so that was taking on quite a bit additional risk for a lot less premium. So, like, for example, this year, if we're trying to find, you know, the sweet point on that risk-reward curve, you know, do we need to bid out different levels or understand what the price point is for different levels of that individual stop-loss insurance so that we can kind of take a history and at least look back in a couple of years and say, oh, well, you know, we would have been a little bit better, you know, 200,000 would have been a better place to go to. Maybe we should move to 200,000 as a town, or I just didn't, you know, should there be some data we're building so we understand where we should put that individual stop-loss?
Well, a couple of things. When it gets bid, it will be bid with all those different variations, so you
Okay,
can see what
good.
the pricing is. You might recall that when we went from 100 to 300, we kind of did take a look at that. You know, what would the results have been had it been like that for the last 5 years? And
Right.
it's not because of your size, however, and given that we're talking about large claimants, we're really talking about anywhere between 5 and 15 people a year. That even looking at 5 years of your history, it's such a real small population that you probably wouldn't want to conclude a great deal. Generally speaking, within your risk tolerance, you want to get that number as high as possible because insurance companies price these products so that they win and you lose. So the lower that number in terms of premium, the better, though that adds volatility. And if you're comfortable that you have the reserves to manage that volatility, which historically you've been and appear still to be, it kind of makes sense to do it. It's a big jump to go from 100 to 300 in 1 year. It would have been better, I think, to do it incrementally over 3 or 4 or 5 years. But so we can lay out that data to take a look at. I just don't know that I would make a lot of decisions based upon it because it's a small population, even if it's 5 years or beyond.
But what you're basically saying is if we keep our reserves, if we're comfortable with our reserve level, and the town is comfortable with the reserve level, we should be, over time, better off at a higher individual stop-loss.
I think so.
Level.
It's just an
Okay.
extension of the whole self-insured. You know, you're better off being self-insured than fully insured
Right.
for all the reasons we talked about. Within the self-insured environment, the lower the premiums you're paying, the more you'll win on average over time, but the more volatility you'll create that you need to manage with reserves.
Okay. Thank you.
Are we then in agreement? We don't have a motion or anything on the floor. Are we in agreement? Do you want to, any ways to confirm that? I don't hear anybody speaking up.
And
Nancy, I'm
again,
sorry, I'm not looking at the end. Excuse
the
me.
board will be voting on the full budget, and you have the opportunity to direct administration to increase or decrease anything that you have a concern about. You could do it tonight, or you could wait until Tuesday night. So if you need some time to kind of cogitate.
Can we just get like a consensus of the board for right now to direct Nancy for the budget for next week?
Tuesday.
For, that, if we want to keep the existing.
I think that would be good. Do you want to state that in the form
Okay,
of a-
sure. Well, I don't know if we need a motion. I think it's just a consensus.
steer clear of a motion.
Okay,
Yeah,
just a
a sense
consensus.
of the board.
Okay,
Yeah.
consensus of the board then. Anybody
Yeah,
speaking?
that we'll just keep it at the existing, yeah.
I disagree, but.
Okay.
But I'm only one voice, so.
Okay.
Okay, I want to make sure any other voices that disagree of keeping it, why don't you say it a little bit louder so everybody hears what you just said? I heard
What's
you.
the
but
exact dollar? It's 1 point, it's the.
It's not a motion, so it's okay.
Yeah,
It can
no,
be
I'm just
general.
looking at, let me get the paper out so I have the exact dollars.
Would you like me to just
Yeah.
rephrase what?
Yeah, would you? Because I'm like
Yes.
looking for the dollars.
Sure. What I'm hearing, consensus, meaning majority, not
Not
all,
a vote.
is that leaving the superintendent's proposed $1.6 million increase at this point in the health insurance account for further discussion and decision-making with conversation with other town bodies and what have you, going forward. So, okay. So it's to continue with our budget at this point so that it fully funds the insurance costs without using the reserve. Okay. Before Steve leaves, while he's here, are there any other questions around the plan, the savings, anything else that would be helpful for anyone on the board? Yeah, that's why he's here.
I just want to ask, I'm assuming that you consult for other towns similar with a similar profile to ours?
Yes.
I guess my question was, you're obviously familiar with our plan, you're familiar with the letter that we have from the town. In terms of the level of risk that we assume as a Board of Ed, where would we fall in terms of some of the other towns that you consult for? I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, where we should be, or are you comfortable with where we are in terms of our health insurance?
I'm comfortable with where you are, particularly given how much time you invest in understanding all these issues. I mean, the key for us is, does everybody get it? And because that's so key to being self-insured, and you all do, obviously. I think if you compared, and we did a survey last year that we're updating now, I think if you compared the actual stop-loss arrangements, for some of your peer districts still remain fully insured because they're uncomfortable with this, the type of fluctuations that you see from month to month. So Ridgefield is still fully insured, Darien is still fully insured. So that's obviously way on the other side of the kind of risk conservative side. Some of the other districts, I don't, other than the Stanford school system, I don't know that there's another district that is at 300,000 from an individual stop loss level. I think most of them are in that 175 to 2.25 kind of level. Many of them are at 115 or 120 from an aggregate stop loss, not 125. So your stop loss program has gone from, you once had a $1.7 million IBNR reserve, now that's $1 million. You were once at 100,000 individual stop loss, which was way too low. You're now at 300, probably among the highest for someone your size, but not inappropriately so. So I think you're assuming more risk now than your peers, marginally from those compared to those that are self-insured, not significantly, but I'm completely comfortable with what you're doing.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Steve, thank you very much for this
Good evening.
background and education along the way. Thank you.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
At the end of our agenda, and we have the announcements and future meetings. Oh, jeez, not again. Sorry, capital budget items. Every time.
Okay. All right. Good?
Yes.
Okay,
Everybody
so-
ready?
So we've learned about the Saks Auditorium. Once again, learned a lot about our insurance, at least I did. Now a conversation about capital items in general. As you remember last week when we met and talked, we talked about having longer discussion around the capital items tonight. That was in part so we could hear from the Saks Auditorium group and learn what the thinking was with the committee, so the board can consider that. Also to go through a little bit more detail the capital requests, which in the handouts that came around, the 5-year capital plan should be there, along with the 5-year capital replacement budget and the 5-year capital technology services. The board last week also asked about the connection with the 5-year capital plan and the facility study that was just recently done and the priorities the priority ones and the priority twos, and were they on the capital plan or weren't they? So I know that Bob and Nancy have put together both the 5-year capital plan and then the other that's coded by school and year and priority, which is sort of a crosswalk of that Silver Petrocelli report and our 5-year plan. So Ms. Harris, would you like to speak to that a bit?
Would love to. Again, as Brian has mentioned, probably the two pieces that are not moving very much are the two single-page handouts. One is the new capital budget for vehicles. And again, it seemed like all the board members understood it, that it was pretty straightforward. As an administrative team, we believe in it. It moves the discussion from the general fund to replace vehicles using a lease process that had been in place since the special ed vans were developed a number of years ago, over a decade ago, I believe, or at least 10, much more than that, Dara's telling me. And so it lays it out with the anticipation that over time, you really do not want vehicles more than between 5 and 8 years as a maximum. So that's what this project lays out. The town has not yet seen this. However, again, we had many discussions over the concept of capital lease and purchasing and where it belonged in the budget. So we took the proactive approach to put it in as a schedule, and we put it in as purchase. However, the funding of the replacements clearly is a town function, not a board function. So should it be decided that lease purchase would be the appropriate, then obviously these dollars shift out, the vehicles stay the same. So I'm not sure if there's anybody that has any questions about this particular schedule.
I guess just the one quick thing I would add is that you will not see a 176,000 or some deduction in any one account because the account is still carrying the existing leases. What you'll see is over time, those will cycle out as they're paid, but this is not a one-to-one offset in the operating budget because of the pre-existing leases that we're carrying.
Right. We're carrying 3 years of leases. I think it was about $54,000, where in the current budget, it's over $76,000. So
20-something.
there is a slight reduction, but we still have to continue paying out on the leases that exist. The second and more complex is the other single page, which is the 5-year capital plan. This also has not changed from last week when Scott addressed all of this, but he is here in case you have further questions. Again, the concept is moving forward after 15-16 to try and smooth out the leased portion. You'll also see that there are dollars associated with the lack of space at Saks, and that we are co-opting 2 computer labs and turning them into classrooms over this summer. And so we need to get 2 mobile carts so that they can be disseminated throughout the school. And while it is not ideal, it will allow us to start this school year, 15-16, continuing our basic programs. The other thing, as Brian had mentioned, is the infrastructure upgrade at the elementary schools, which began this year with the grant that Dr. Miller had talked with you about last year, and that we implemented and purchased about $80,300 worth of equipment somewhere in that general vicinity. So again, this is now moving into implementing the balance of that plan. So let me pause and see if you've got any questions for Scott.
Jen?
Can I just ask, for the 2015-16 lease program, the $200,000, what exactly does that, you probably don't remember this, but I just want to know.
The list that we saw last week was
Last week.
basically a projection backwards to get it about over $700,000 of spending power out of that $200,000 payment. So we have an itemized list that's
That's in the
based.
budget book.
Yes.
It's in here.
We have an itemized list based on wants and needs put forth by the different schools and by the district. And then from that, we culled that into the itemized list you saw last week.
And that whole list was developed with significant communication. Jill and I, Rob and Scott, along with a number of other folks, met with each principal and their entire team to try and identify all the needs that they foresaw for next year. And then you start prioritizing.
Okay. Any other questions about technology? I think everybody understands. Okay, moving along.
Great. So now, the elephant in the room, besides healthcare, is of course the 5-year facilities capital plan. There are some modifications to the 5-year capital plan. As I went through and took a look at a few different items, one, I realized that we had not scheduled in, under the painting lines, additional years. So I did plug in for 16, 17, along with, I think it was 18, 19, some repeat of painting needs, because that really has to be an ongoing kind of approach to our 880,000 square feet that we must maintain. So the dollars at the bottom of your summary, you'll notice, are different because of that oversight on my part last time, and this gave me the opportunity to correct that. The other piece of it, and again, the board had asked specifically, how does this 5-year capital plan relate to the facilities analysis study that was done and presented to the board by Silver Petroselli and Associates? And so you've got 2 pages, 2 handouts. One is titled Priorities Number 1, and the other is titled Priorities Number 2 Priorities. And what Bob and I attempted to do, I sorted all of the report, the Silver Petroselli report, by priority number. And then chose only to look at, well, I looked at everything, but only to deal with specifically those items that they labeled priority number 1 and priority number 2. Then went back, and I actually have my old working copy of the capital budget with colors so that we could connect the dots between the items themselves and where they fall in the capital plan. So as you look at each of these attachments, you'll see that they are sorted by the 3rd column on the attachment. I'm sorry, the 2nd column that says year. So 14, 15 are those items that Bob has either already fixed or will be fixing in the second half of this fiscal year. Again, they are important items, and in many instances, they are relatively small amounts that we will pick up through our operating budget. You will see where it says spring 2015, spring maybe into May, because there's some things that deal with grounds where we're really not going to be working on them until late spring. You will also see, again, on priority 2, the pages that are priority 2, an awful lot of those, that first full page is items that we will be repairing in-house. The estimated amounts are from Silver Petrocelli. Bob is incredibly creative. He will do some of this in-house with his own staff for less dollars than this. Some of it may be plus or minus. Again, it's easy, hopefully this makes it easy for you to tie back. And then you can see as we start looking into 15, 16, it starts tying to the capital budget. So let me stop talking again, let you take a look at it, and then Bob's here to answer the real questions.
Oh, Sherry.
So I'm assuming that priority 1 covers anything with safety concerns. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't, if I went through, and I haven't had the opportunity yet, but to look through the lower priority items that have been deprioritized for budget purposes, there's no safety-related items that have been deprioritized. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then my other question is, so I think you may have said this, I just wasn't clear, but so how do we have priority 1 items that are being timed out to like 1920? So like, shouldn't the priority correlate with the timing?
Well, things like the oil tanks and the boiler replacements. The oil tanks are listed as a priority 1. However, in the description, they said within the next 5 years. So again, because we don't have issues right now, closely monitoring, dipping the tanks on a daily basis. Bob's going to have the tanks pressure tested again, and we'll do that at least once a year so that we can continue to monitor them.
So I'd say it's a balance of importance and urgency in the prioritization.
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that priority reflected the importance of getting it done, but not when? I.e., in 5 years, the tank's really got to be done, otherwise you might have a real problem, or a roof might have to be done in 5 years, while something which is priority 3, regardless of when it has to be done, isn't as important to get done exactly on time.
You said it much better than I did, Jean.
Other questions about the capital needs? Yes. Yes.
I just have a
Penny?
question for Bob about the window caulking at Saks. I'm assuming that when, in the 1997's renovation, all new windows were put in and all new caulking was put in throughout Saks? Well, unlike the situation at South when we put in new windows and they maintain the wood border and the old caulking, I was assuming when I looked at that item at Saks that I thought we put in all new windows throughout Saks and all new caulking back in 1997.
I don't know if all the windows were brand new.
Maybe, except for maybe, I don't know about the glass block in the gym or anything like that, excluding that.
And I'm not quite sure that when they removed the windows, they removed all the old caulking. So before we go back and do it, we need to do the due diligence and make sure we don't have another issue.
Okay.
Other questions on capital projects? Sherry?
Just that, I assume we need to have the discussion now about the Saks auditorium line item. Currently, Nancy has the 4 million built in. So I personally think that we should be budgeting 10 million. I feel strongly that we as a board should be advocating for option 2, which meets our capacity needs in an efficient, cost-efficient manner. So I would put that on the table to suggest that we increase that line item to 10 million.
Is that a motion?
I don't know if we need a motion.
Is it a motion or not?
Do we need a motion? Okay.
No.
No, it's not necessarily an action item. They're still building the budget, and you're giving feedback to us for
Right,
the budget
so
to bring
feedback
forward
based
next
upon
week.
today's presentation that,
But we need to know if there's a consensus of the board.
right.
Yes.
Right.
How would we do
And
it?
I am of that same opinion.
And I as well.
Okay,
As I, yeah.
yes. Anybody who is not of that consensus?
I'm not there yet.
Allison?
I just want to say, I mean, 10 million is a show-stopping number. I mean, it's huge, it's significant, and I don't think any of us were thinking that number along the line. When we were discussing this earlier, I don't think we understood it was going to be that, we were even going to be talking anywhere near that number. But I think we have to respect the amount of time, first of all, the talent on this committee and the amount of time they've put into it and the thoroughness of the project. So I think it's going to be our job, really, honestly, to sell this project. I mean, we've spent, not quite a decade, I think Alan's left, but close to a decade building an incredible VPA program. The town's invested in it, a tremendous amount of time, money, we've got a tremendous amount of talent, and we've been so successful at the high school level. This program feeds, the Saks School feeds that. We've got hundreds of kids participating in musicals. I mean, we've built this program. We have to give them a facility to be able to function in. I think Greg spoke, pretty articulately about his hands are tied in terms of what he's currently working with. So to me, I don't think we have a choice. I mean, I think we want to do this once. We want to do it right. And I think those of us who lived through the earlier school projects, we had very talented committees who worked on them. Decisions were made for the reasons they were made, but we spent a lot of money and a lot of time kind of making up for things that weren't done during those periods. That it's easy at the time to go for the lower number. Several years later, everyone's shaking their head saying, why didn't they do that when they were doing the entire project? So I don't want to find us there. Having said that, I respect that this is a very high number and that we're going to have to sell this and sell this well.
I think our timing, too, as far as the project and the problems that we've found that are part of this auditorium, and the idea of knowing that it was built 50 years ago, 60 years ago. That's a long time, and it missed the rehab, just what you're saying. The last time, the budget ran out, and so they just weren't able to do it. And as a result, there have been a number of things having to do with disabilities, having to do with safety, many different things that have been part of that auditorium that we've let it go. Deanna?
I agree, it's a lot of money, but I think I always have a harder time throwing good money after bad. And to spend $5 million and not have what we really need as a district, and to have to go back and spend an additional $1.7 million 3 years down the road, and it'll probably be more than 1 point, it'll be 2.5 to 3 at that point, to add the space that we need at that point, to me is just a colossal waste of opportunity and a displacement of those students, because not only are we having to deal with this issue this year, and the kids are displaced, and we have this issue, then in 2 or 3 years we're going to displace those kids again. Obviously, it's a different group of kids, but it's a disruption to the faculty, it's a disruption to the school system, and it's a lot of extra money to the taxpayer in the long run. And I think it's important that we all look at things in a long-term view, and when we don't, and we've done that over and over in this town where we don't take a long-term view, people are upset, and as a taxpayer, I'd be upset, and I have kids in this district as well. Nobody's going to be at Saks, but I think we have to be looking out. Our job is to look out for the students in this district, and it is important. It's just important. And I would highlight that I don't think Greg highlighted, we are getting more STEM space. I looked at the square footage in the STEM classrooms, and for a priority measure in this district, we're getting more STEM space. So I think it's a good thing.
Sangeeta?
I was just, that STEM space gets to be designated and re-looked at to be really efficient as a STEM space rather than just converting a room that we have right now. But just, to reiterate that we're not looking at, again, as Allison mentioned, of adding luxury space. This is not a luxury. We are already overcrowded. You look at those figures of what we're putting into those rooms, we're over the state recommended capacity for those spaces, to use them efficiently. So we are, again, just meeting the needs that we have now and also foreseeing some of the stuff that are coming by the time it gets built. So if we're looking to do this 3 years down the road, again, we're looking at where we're putting these kids and stuff, and then you have to build after that 2 or 3 years. So, you're looking, much further down. And so just looking at it, we need this now. It's not something that, really, it's like, should we or shouldn't we? It's not a luxury.
And I wouldn't really refer to myself as the lone dissenter because I'm not convinced that it's not the right thing to do. I sure want a little bit more time to think about it. I can't even buy a shirt the first time I go into a store. But I do think that $5 million, there's no question we need to renovate the existing space. And $5 million, which doesn't include the cost of covering whatever hazardous materials we find, we've got a wish list, at least according to what I read in the paper, of $17 million. This is on top of that. I just am not sure that in terms of priorities for $5 million, I really want to think about, is this the best use of the $5 million we're going to ask the town for? And there's no question we should have done the Saks Auditorium the first time. And we may come back and say, hey, we really should have put the expansion on the rooms when we did this project. And like I say, I'm not sure that I won't get there, but I'm certainly not there yet.
Well, yes, Allison?
I just want to say, I guess one of the ways I'm looking at it is we'll spend $5 million and we won't even solve our current problems. So my concern is not only will we not solve our current problems, but there'll be additional problems created over the next 2 or 3 years by the time this is finished with increased enrollment and everything else that's going on. So I don't see how this will be looked upon as a good decision if we're spending $5 million and, as I said, still not solving the problems that we currently have today.
We won't solve them all.
We'll be able to actually use the space, but much beside that, you're right.
We won't solve the overcrowding. I think that's the one that worries us all, or the storage. Sherry?
I definitely respect that opinion, and I think we should spend more time kind of understanding your concerns, because certainly there's going to be a community of those same questions and concerns, and we need to be ready to, as we move this forward, to address those questions. But I think it's really important to point out that as time progresses, 60 years, and as our population grows and as our needs change, we have to invest. And as the Board of Education, we need to advocate for that investment. Just like, they're investing in the town hall, and the Y is investing $25 million in an expansion there, and the library is advocating for an expansion there. I mean, this school, the auditorium, hasn't been updated in 60 years. It's outdated, and I think we need to advocate for the needs of our kids. And Greg had me at hello when he started talking about the student learning, flexibility, the programming that will be improved if we go with option 2. So I want us to, as the Board of Education, to stay focused on the changing needs of our students and the opportunity that's in front of us here.
Yes, Deanna?
If there's any additional information that anybody thinks of that they want regarding this, if you think about it overnight, please email me, let me know. We obviously winnowed it down because we didn't want to take all your time tonight. But I would be happy to answer any more questions. The slides to me that were really compelling were the one that showed the 288 versus the
195.
Yeah, well, the 338, or what we currently have. And I think we currently have a situation that we should correct.
Penny, is...
Yeah, versus the 195, which is what it's built for according to today's standards. I think that was what we found as a committee, and that was why we actually thought it was our duty to kind of bring forward these 2 options. And we do have 2 members of the town council on our committee.
Are the books,
And we were unanimous in our recommendation.
are the books going to be online on our site so that the audience can, anybody who's watching television can find?
I think
look
so.
at
I
those?
think what we want to do is we want to do some labeling of the pictures and a few small changes like that, so it stands on its own. So that
Okay.
they shortly will be.
So shortly. Okay, terrific. Yes, Deanna, then Sangeeta.
I think also in addition to the STEM space, I don't want to underestimate sort of the added VPA offerings, because I think that there are kids in this district that may not want to participate in, you know, a large group ensemble or whatever. But, you know, the fact that we don't have a jazz band in the middle school is, I think, pretty sad that, you know, that those kids don't have that opportunity because they just don't have the time. I mean, I think there's opportunities to do little things, but you know, I mean, those options were available when I was going to school, and we don't have that in this district, and we're a pretty great district, and we should have that here. And we should have those great opportunities for kids to develop and grow, and you know, we can't do that with the space we have right now, and I think it's important not to minimize that just because it's a, you know, a smaller group of kids that might be impacted, so.
Sangeeta?
Yeah, and I respect, again, you know, Scott, that it is important to think about all these different things because there are a lot of factors, but, you know, we're going to be touching SACS right now, and whatever we do, I don't foresee us going back in again and being able to retouch it and go back and do another capital, you know, event for it. So I think we have to look at where we're at. The school district has done a fabulous job of repurposing every space that's available in that place. We know it's one of the largest, it is the largest middle school in the state, and so it does require some investment because it's not the same. I think if you look at all the schools, that's the one that has the most need because that's the one that has the biggest population in terms of what the size and what's available there for the kids. And, you know, so capacity is a big issue. So it's something to think about that, you know, this is an opportunity for us to go in. What is the most cost-effective way of really resolving things? And I think the flexibility, as it's been mentioned, to being able to do, even though you're looking at just the VPA, it does affect all the other programs because even the way you disperse, what I understand from Greg, how the classes are dispersed, you know, so if all the girls want to go to choir, at that period, the only other class that's available, then you have a class that's predominantly all male because all the girls are doing choir and it's only available at that time. So you kind of offset a lot of other learning things, you know, from what I was understanding, that it's complex, you know, how much flexibility you get in scheduling just by relieving some of this pressure here that helps in a lot of different fields, not just in the VPA programs. And again, I am kind of concerned about will we have an opportunity to go back in again and do another correction at some later date after we do a big investment right now.
Jean?
I would suggest that if Scott were to, which he did ask Greg, is this the best use you could make of the $5 million? You have to bear in mind that this is capital. So the fair question is this the best $5 million that Greg could use as a capital expense item? One, if you were to convert it to operating, first of all, $5 million would be every year. You could then say, well, maybe $700,000 because operating goes over and over and over again. But you just can't say, is this the best way you can spend $5 million unless you quantify that in some way. But it's a very good question. But it's not that simple.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in? I think we have a large number of people who are in favor of this and some that are thinking about it maybe. And we will have a chance to vote on this.
And as Penny mentioned before, we welcome questions between now and Tuesday. Sure.
Right, yeah. And if you want my consultants back on next Tuesday to ask more questions, let me know, because I need to make sure that they can come.
Yes. Yes, Jen?
Can I just add one thing? So it's pretty scary. I actually grew up in this town, and I was sitting in that auditorium 1,000 years ago. And it's been overlooked for so long, and these kids work so hard in these programs. And, you know, you go in there, and you can't even hear them sing, and then you go during the school hours. And I know that I don't know if we're talking about doing a tour of the facilities, but if you've ever been at SACS during passing time, you know, you go down, there's music everywhere, there's instruments everywhere, kids are tripping, like, it might be helpful just to go. I don't know if we could go at that point during classes or in session, et cetera. You see the overcrowding, and you also hear, like, all the music. It's so awesome. I mean, it's such a great thing, and I know it's a big number. I know it's a big number, but again, our enrollment is increasing, and we do have to think long-term, and
Sure. You know, I'm not in any, I think I've been as big an advocate of complete child education and healthy choices and all that. It isn't about that for me. It's just a matter of really making sure that, you know, the kind of thoughts that go through my mind is, if this is going to be our one chance to touch Saks, and we're adding 2 tiny little classrooms, are we doing enough? Maybe we should be adding 6 classrooms, because that's really what we need. And these are all, you know, like I say, I came here expecting a budget of $4 million and was handed one of 10, and it's just something I need to kind of get comfortable with, I guess. I do have another question, and I frankly can't even myself believe I'm going to ask this because of the relentless Guff has not quit from my last automobile question. But we use our vans to take individual students to schools in other districts, right?
that's correct.
Would it make sense for us to get a Prius or a Volt or a small, I mean, why are we using a Chevy Suburban to take one kid to, assuming we are, to take one kid to a school an hour away?
With all due respect, we aren't necessarily doing that. Some of the vehicles have between 2 and 4 students. We try to combine the number of students for the runs that are far. The vehicles are also used to transport students within districts, so it's a combination of both the out-of-district placements and also for students who require specialized transportation in district, and there are a number of those. So I don't want the board to think that all of those vehicles are used for just the between 15 and 20 students that we have being transported. It's a significant number more than that. I don't have the number with me, but.
Yeah, that wasn't my thought. My thought was, in addition to these vehicles, would it make sense to get, you know, if we could.
Smaller vehicles.
Yeah, a smaller vehicle or 2, an electric vehicle, you know, something like that.
Well, part of what you want to look at is that, for instance, if we're transporting one child an hour away from us, you're not only transporting the child, but you're also transporting possibly a nurse, possibly a monitor as well, and you need to make sure that there is full 4-wheel drive because we're transporting those youngsters whenever there's school in session. So it doesn't mean that we couldn't consider 1 or 2 smaller vehicles. However, something as small as a Prius, I would tell you I wouldn't recommend. One,
I'm not advocating for a Prius or for any
Okay.
particular individual car. Don't
but
get me
in
wrong.
terms of
You know?
what,
Yes, the Prius.
what you do want to look at is the flexibility, and again, over time, as you replace older vehicles with newer vehicles, and they need to be interchangeable, because if one breaks down, you have to bring, you have to shift the vehicles around. So I will take your concept
I
back.
guess I just wanted to know we're thinking about it.
It wouldn't happen initially. It might happen in years 4 and 5, or even year 3, as we get some more reliable vehicles, then it probably would make some sense to look at smaller 4-wheel drive available types of vehicles as well. Because the Suburban or that type of vehicle, and again, we're not necessarily buying a particular make and model at this point in time, because we're looking 5 years out.
Subaru.
I was going to say, I think the issue becomes the issue of safety, reliability, and ability to be able to function well in bad weather. So, certainly we'll bring that information back. But those are three really important things.
Any vehicle we use goes through a rigorous certification procedure as well. It's not that we buy something that's off the lot. They run it through, state inspectors come down, there's certain modifications and things and safety checks. I'm not sure what the limitations of those are. They may have a short list of vehicles that can be so modified. We'd have to find out.
I wanted to ask one question, if I could, going back to our other topic, and of Greg, if I could. And that would be when we're talking about space and thinking about, I remember in one of our meetings that you had mentioned about flexible space, and we're certainly thinking with the design of the option number 2, that the spaces that are there, you had mentioned about how one could be divided. And is there anything to preclude those spaces from being used by another sort of a class other than just a class that's in the arts, if that was what you needed to schedule?
Not at all. The big idea in option 2 is that if you add space to a campus which is already overcrowded at 1,200 and you're projecting at least to 1,400 and maybe beyond, you can't lose in that equation. Because the big concept is you're adding flexibility to the campus, where presently we don't have that flexibility. I think about this concept of building for the future, and I've been in the position long enough to see that there is a season and a rhythm and an ebb and flow to when you make big item capital decisions and capital improvements to a campus. I was the beneficiary of doubling the square footage of the campus from 97 to 2,000. We went from 100,000 square feet to 200,000 square feet. That was an enormous investment in the school, which today no one would question, but people questioned it then. So I would just think about the lifespan of the next addition on the campus. It's probably 30 to 50 years. So if we miss an opportunity now, it won't be for want of educating the community about the need. And so I think the committee certainly did its due diligence in honoring the charge to look at the small, immediate concerns, but also the big picture and the larger context. I also remember when this same conversation was taking place about the athletic program in town, and my middle school was the host varsity football field. And there were decisions to obviously build the artificial turf stadium. But we built a beautiful stadium, and then we didn't, as a town, look at the auxiliary practice spaces. So we had a wonderful stadium to play official games in, but we then had to go through another process in upgrading all the practice fields and increasing capacity for practice. So I would say that that's probably a good lesson as we look at the music program as a analogy. Do we want to just build the auditorium the way it should be, but not have the appropriate practice spaces?
Any other questions, Jess?
One more thing. So
Jen?
Greg, if, like, kind of what Scott touched upon, is it enough? Like, if we're going in and this is our one touch to Saks, like the next 10 years possibly,
or 50,
is
I
it
think
enough?
the question about what's realistic to envision, the vision for changing that campus is muted. There really aren't a lot of leverage points in terms of where you can build out. I think that literally the genius in some of the architectural work that was done is to take the existing footprint in a minor way to disturb that campus to get that added flexibility. There really aren't other points of that campus that speak loudly to that capability. The only other place on that campus to to build an extension is on the northwest corner. That's the corner of Farm and South, where you look at the 8th grade wing. And that has some ability to put on another finger facing Farm Road. But that would be an enormous project at an enormous cost, and the amount of space that would project it into a wing like that, I think would be subject to a charge of an overbuild.
Thanks.
Okay, we've been thinking and very carefully looking at things, and thank you very much to the administration and to the staff for presenting all these options to us and giving us so much information to think about. I'm very appreciated. And looking ahead, announcements and future meetings.
Sure. Our next meeting is on Tuesday, due to the 3-day weekend with Martin Luther King Day. That will be the 20th. We will have the second reading of our operating budget, and we will take tonight's discussion under advisement and into consideration and putting all of that together. So thank you very much for the feedback and dialogue about all of those things. We'll also take another look at that district calendar for 2016-17 that we presented at the last meeting, and update on the South project. Also, as Penny had mentioned before, I think update on the South project. We'll see where that is. I don't know if that's ready. Yeah, I'm getting a yes. But as Penny mentioned in the beginning with Saks, we also are, the letters went out, and as you know, the auditorium currently is closed due to the testing that we had done. And currently, the ceramics room is closed due to preliminary testing. As we did with the auditorium, we are acting very, very cautiously, using an abundance of caution in closing the ceramics room so that we can do some further testing to see the state of that room. Then we'll make some decisions. We anticipate that we'll have some more information soon, and as soon as we do, we will be scheduling some parent meetings to discuss what we know, share what we know, and what the next steps are, what the plan might be. We'll also be having that conversation at an upcoming Board of Education meeting. So this is it unfolds as a process as we go. As you know, it was connected initially to the Saks Auditorium because before you go into a plan like this, you want to do some environmental testing, given the regulations around those things. Now, where we are, Ty and Bond will come and advise us. That they are our environmentalists. They'll advise us as to our next steps, and we'll be talking about that along the way. So we anticipate the last week in January to be able to schedule a meeting for staff and for parents with Ty and Bond to talk about the results and what we know and what our next steps will be.
Sounds like a good schedule. You're talking about the calendar reminded me to remind people that if they want to make any suggestions, they can, of course, email to us. The calendar is online on our site, and so if any parent or anybody has any suggestions, by all means, contact us. At this point, motion to adjourn. Thank you, Deanna. Second, Sangeeta. All in favor? Sorry, it was not on the agenda. If it isn't on my, it got missed. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to, a good point before, pardon, we don't have it on our agenda by accident. So we'll look forward to anybody that wants to, anybody that would like to speak with us, by all means, please come next Tuesday. We'd be very interested in hearing what you have to say. Or email us. We always read our emails too. Now, is there someone, we had a first, second, all those in favor of us adjourning? And that is all hands, Mr. Gress, up. Mr. Gress, yes, thank you. Yes, that's everybody adjourning. Thank you.